All right, guys, this is lesson 5-4, and we're going to talk a lot about an isosceles triangle. But before we do that, we need to kind of discuss the anatomy of an isosceles triangle and what each part is called. So, if you recall, an isosceles triangle is a triangle where two sides are congruent. Okay, well, those two congruent sides of an isosceles triangle are called the legs. Okay, the third side that is not congruent to the other sides is called the base. So we have two legs and then we have a base. The legs are congruent, the base is a different length. Okay, the vertex angle is the angle formed by the sides of an isosceles triangle, or maybe I should put the legs, formed by the legs of an isosceles triangle. And then the base angles are the two angles adjacent to the base. Okay, so they're on the sides of the base. Here's a base angle, here's a base angle. So this is the general anatomy of an isosceles triangle. All right, so we do have two theorems here. The base angles theorem, which we'll use quite a bit, it says if two sides of a triangle are congruent, so if we have an isosceles triangle, so this side and this side are congruent, this theorem tells us the base angles will also be congruent. So if the two sides are congruent, then the two angles are congruent. Okay, the converse of that is also true, which means if we know that two angles of a triangle are congruent, then their opposite sides will also be congruent. All right, so let's look at example 1. We're given that side DE and side DF are congruent. So if we have two congruent sides of a triangle, that means we have to have two congruent angles. And to determine which angles are congruent, we're going to go through the triangle and do the opposite angles from the congruent sides. Okay, so like that. So I could say that angle E is congruent to angle F. All right, I want you guys to take a minute and try to do A and B on your own here in example 2, and then we'll go over it. All right, let's look at part A. So part A tells me that HG is congruent to HK. Okay, now I want you to notice that those two sides, if I'm just looking at that triangle, it has nothing to do with this triangle over here. I can totally ignore that for now and just focus on triangle HGK. Okay, well, if these two highlighted sides are congruent, the opposite angles are going to be congruent. So I can say that angle G is congruent to angle HKG. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and erase all that. All right, so part B tells me angle KHJ, so KHJ. So that's this triangle. If that triangle is congruent to KJH, which is this triangle, then what? Well, guys, this is the opposite. This angle here and this angle here have nothing to do with this triangle on the left. Okay, so I'm going to focus solely on this triangle highlighted in yellow. Okay, I know that this angle is congruent to this angle, and so that means the opposite sides will also be congruent, so that means that KJ is congruent to KH. All right, so let's look at example 3. In example 3, we're given that all three sides of this triangle are congruent. So if you notice, each side has the same tick mark. Well, if two sides of the triangles are congruent, we know that two angles are congruent. But if three sides of the triangle are congruent, that means three angles are congruent. Okay, so since all three sides of this triangle are congruent, we know that each one of these angles has to be congruent as well. Okay, well, let's just call them each x. Okay, we know if we add them all up, so if I say x plus x plus x, they would equal 180. All angles of a triangle add up to 180. So if if I just simplify this, divide by 3, I'd get x equals 60. So each one of these angles is 60 degrees. All right, so let's look at example 4 now. So here I'm given that all 3 angles are congruent. Well, if all 3 angles are congruent, that means all 3 sides are congruent. So if this side is 5, that means this side has to be 5, and this side has to be 5 as well. All right, well, I want you to try to do example 5 on your own. Just take it piece by piece by piece. Try to figure it out, and then we'll go over it. All right, let's go over it. Hopefully you were able to figure this out. So first thing, I'm going to look at this triangle on the left. Okay, so I'm going to highlight it here in green. And I'm not even going to worry about what's on the right. So just this triangle on the left, I notice that all angles are congruent. Okay, all 3 angles are congruent. And therefore, I know that all 3 sides have to be congruent as well. Well, that means that y is 4, because this side is 4, and this side is also 4. Okay, now I'm going to turn my attention to this triangle. Okay, and I notice in this triangle, this base angle here and this base angle over here are congruent, which means their opposite sides are congruent. Okay, well, I know this side is 4, which means this side has to also equal 4. So if I say x plus 1 equals 4 minus 1, I get x equals 3. So here's my x and here's my y. All right, guys, go ahead and try this one on your own as well. All right, so let's look at this. Let's look at this triangle first. So this one on the right. Okay, now I notice that all 3 of these sides are congruent because they both have 2 tick marks. Okay, and because all 3 sides are congruent, I know all 3 angles are congruent. And if I divide 180 by 3, that means each angle is 60 degrees. Okay. All right, now notice this whole angle is 90 degrees. So if this is 60, this whole thing is 90, this has to be 30. Okay, well, if I look at this, this side, now I'm looking at this left triangle now, guys. Probably should have mentioned that. This side here and this side here are congruent, which means this angle and this angle are congruent. So this also has to be 30 degrees. Okay, well, y, I don't know what it is, but I have 2 of the 3 angles of a triangle. So I could say 30 plus y has to equal 180. So 60 plus y equals 180 minus 60. Y then is 120. And that would be your final answer.